Maria Santos had been cleaning office buildings in downtown Chicago for 12 years. Every morning at 4:30, her alarm would pierce through the darkness of her small apartment on the south side. By 5:15, she was already walking through the empty streets, her cleaning supplies rattling in the wheeled cart she pulled behind her. The October wind cut through her thin jacket, but Maria had learned long ago that complaining about the cold wouldn't make it any warmer. The industry's building stood 42 stories tall, its glass windows reflecting the early morning streetlights like 1,000 watching eyes. Maria knew every inch of that building. She knew which elevator made a grinding noise on the 23rd floor, which bathroom faucet leaked in the executive wing, and exactly how long it took to vacuum each floor from top to bottom. What she didn't know was that this particular Tuesday morning would change everything. Maria started her routine on the top floors, working her way down. The executive level was always her first stop because the important people arrived early and they expected perfection. She moved quietly through the hallways, her soft-soled shoes making barely a whisper against the marble floors. The silence was broken only by the gentle hum of the heating system and the occasional ding of the elevator carrying the first wave of morning workers. At 6:45, Maria wheeled her cart toward the service elevator to head down to the 38th floor. As she passed the large windows overlooking the alley behind the building, something caught her eye. Down below, next to the massive green dumpsters that served the entire building, she saw movement. At first, she thought it might be a stray cat or maybe one of the homeless people who sometimes sought shelter in the alley. But as she pressed her face closer to the glass, squinting through the early morning light, her heart nearly stopped. There was a child down there. Maria abandoned her cart and ran to the stairwell, her feet pounding against the concrete steps as she descended 42 floors as fast as her legs could carry her. By the time she burst through the emergency exit into the alley, her lungs were burning and her hands were shaking. The smell of garbage and rotting food filled her nostrils, but she pushed forward, her eyes scanning the shadows between the dumpsters. And there she was. A little girl no more than 5 years old sat curled up against the brick wall behind the largest dumpster. Her hair was matted and dirty, her pale skin marked with bruises and scratches. She wore a pink nightgown that had once been beautiful but was now torn and stained with mud and worse things. Her bare feet were blue with cold, and her small body shivered uncontrollably. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Maria whispered, dropping to her knees beside the child. "Baby, what are you doing out here?" The little girl looked up with the bluest eyes Maria had ever seen. They were filled with fear and confusion, but also something else that broke Maria's heart completely, hope. The child didn't speak, but she didn't pull away when Maria reached out to touch her face. "Are you hurt, sweetheart?" Maria asked, her voice gentle despite the panic rising in her chest. She could see that the child was in shock, probably hypothermic. Without hesitation, Maria pulled off her own jacket and wrapped it around the tiny frame. "We need to get you warm. We need to get you safe." The little girl still didn't speak, but she allowed Maria to lift her up. She was so light, too light for a child her age. As Maria carried her toward the building's back entrance, she felt the child's small arms wrap around her neck, clinging desperately. Inside the building, Maria's mind raced. She should call the police immediately, she knew that, but something told her to be careful. How did a child this young end up in an alley behind one of Chicago's most exclusive business districts? This wasn't a random abandonment. The child's nightgown, despite its current condition, was clearly expensive. The way she carried herself, even in her traumatized state, spoke of privilege and careful upbringing. Maria made a decision that would later prove to be crucial. Instead of calling 911 from the lobby where the security cameras would record everything, she took the child up to the executive floor's private bathroom. There, she cleaned the little girl's face and hands with warm water from the sink, speaking softly to her the entire time. "My name is Maria," she said, dabbing gently at a cut on the child's cheek. "I'm going to take care of you, okay? You're safe now. Can you tell me your name?" For the first time, the child spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse from crying and cold. "Emma." "Emma," Maria repeated, her heart swelling with relief that the child could speak. "That's a beautiful name. Emma, do you remember how you got outside?" The little girl's eyes filled with tears and she shook her head frantically. "I was sleeping," she whispered. "Then I was in the dark and it was cold and scary." Maria felt anger rising in her chest like a fire. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had taken this child from her bed and left her to die in an alley. But who and why? As if reading her thoughts, Emma looked up at Maria with those piercing blue eyes and said something that made Maria's blood run cold. "The bad man said my daddy wouldn't miss me." Before Maria could ask any more questions, she heard voices in the hallway outside. The morning shift was arriving and she needed to think fast. She couldn't just walk out of the building with a child. The security guards would stop her, ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. But she also couldn't leave Emma alone, not for a second. Maria made another split-second decision. She gathered Emma in her arms again and carried her to the supply closet where she stored her personal belongings. It wasn't ideal, but it was warm and safe, and more importantly, it was a place where no one would think to look. "Emma, honey, I need you to stay here for just a few minutes while I figure out how to help you," Maria said, settling the child on a pile of clean towels. "Can you be very quiet for me?" Emma nodded, still clutching Maria's jacket around her small frame. "Will you come back?" "I promise," Maria said, and she meant it with every fiber of her being. Maria locked the supply closet and returned to her cleaning duties, but her mind was spinning. She needed help, but she wasn't sure who she could trust. The police were the obvious choice, but something told her that whoever had taken Emma might have connections, might be watching for exactly that kind of move. The child's expensive nightgown, her refined way of speaking despite her age, her comment about daddy, it all pointed to money, serious money. As Maria mechanically pushed her vacuum cleaner across the executive floor's carpet, she found herself studying the family photos that decorated the various offices. Chicago's business elite smiled back at her from behind expensive frames, CEOs and their picture-perfect families, all perfectly posed and professionally lit. She had cleaned around these photos for years without really seeing them, but now she looked at each one with new eyes, searching for a face that might match the little girl hidden in her supply closet. It was in the corner office, the one belonging to the building's most important tenant, that Maria found what she was looking for. Richard III, the billionaire real estate mogul who owned half of downtown Chicago, smiled out from a family portrait that dominated one wall of his office. Next to him stood an elegant woman with dark hair and pearls, and between them, holding their hands, was a little girl with hair and the bluest eyes Maria had ever seen. The same eyes that had looked up at her in the alley just an hour ago. Maria's hands shook as she set down her vacuum cleaner and moved closer to the photograph. There was no doubt about it. The child in the closet was Emma, daughter of one of the most powerful men in Chicago. But if that was true, then why was she thrown away in an alley like garbage? And more importantly, who had done it? The sound of voices in the hallway snapped Maria back to reality. She quickly resumed her cleaning, her mind working frantically to process this new information. Richard was known throughout the city not just for his wealth, but for his ruthless business practices and his fierce protection of his family's privacy. Maria had never seen him in person, but his reputation preceded him. He was the kind of man who could make problems disappear with a phone call. But if this was his daughter, then he would want her back, wouldn't he? Unless... Maria's blood ran cold as another possibility occurred to her. What if Richard didn't know his daughter was missing? What if whoever had taken Emma was someone close to the family, someone who knew their routines and had access to their home? What if Emma's disappearance was part of something bigger, something more dangerous than a simple kidnapping? The morning progressed with agonizing slowness. Every few minutes, Maria found an excuse to check on Emma, bringing her water and crackers from her lunch bag. The little girl seemed to be recovering slightly from her ordeal, but she remained largely silent, answering Maria's gentle questions with nods or single words. "Emma, sweetheart, do you remember anything about the person who took you from your house?" Maria asked during one of her visits to the supply closet. Emma's face immediately clouded with fear. "He was tall," she whispered, "and he smelled like cigarettes. He said my mommy and daddy didn't want me anymore." Maria's heart broke a little more. "That's not true, baby. I'm sure your parents are looking for you right now. Do you remember anything else about the man?" Emma thought for a moment, her small brow furrowed in concentration. "He had a ring," she said finally. "A big ring with a red stone, and he talked to someone on the phone. He said the job was done." A chill ran down Maria's spine. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was a professional job carried out by someone who was being paid to make Emma disappear. But paid by whom? As the morning wore on, Maria's dilemma grew more complex by the hour. She knew she should contact the authorities, but something told her that doing so might put Emma in even greater danger. If the kidnappers had connections within the police force or the city government, Reporting Emma's rescue could simply deliver her back into their hands. On the other hand, keeping silent meant that Emma's parents might be suffering, not knowing whether their daughter was dead or alive. It was just after 11 o'clock when Maria's decision was made for her. She was cleaning the main conference room when she overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two security guards were standing just outside the door, speaking in low voices, but Maria's years of working in backgrounds had taught her to be invisible, and people often forgot she was there. "The word came down from upstairs," one guard was saying. "Nobody talks to the press about the situation. Complete media blackout until further notice." "What situation?" the second guard asked. "Their kid went missing 2 nights ago, taken right out of her bedroom. They're keeping it quiet while they handle it privately." "Jesus, any leads?" "Nothing solid, but the old man's bringing in some serious people to handle it, the kind of people who don't ask questions." Maria's hands stilled on her cleaning cloth. Richard knew his daughter was missing, and he was handling it privately. That meant he wasn't working with the police either, at least not officially. But his resources were far greater than anything Maria could offer, and his serious people would be much better equipped to protect Emma than one cleaning lady with nowhere to turn. But it also meant that Maria was sitting on information that could reunite a desperate father with his missing child. The moral weight of that knowledge was almost unbearable. As she finished cleaning the conference room, Maria made her decision. She would find a way to contact Richard directly, bypassing the security guards and the potential threats that might be monitoring official channels. It was risky, but it was the right thing to do. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. At 12:30, the executive elevator opened, and Richard himself stepped out. Maria had seen his photograph countless times, but seeing him in person was something else entirely. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. But today, those eyes were shadowed with worry and exhaustion. This was not the confident billionaire from the newspaper photos. This was a father whose child was missing. He walked past Maria without acknowledging her presence, heading toward his office with the measured stride of a man carrying an enormous burden. Maria watched him go, her heart pounding with the magnitude of what she was about to do. Taking a deep breath, she followed him down the hallway. Richard's office door was slightly ajar when Maria approached. Through the gap, she could see him standing at the window, his cell phone pressed to his ear, speaking in urgent, clipped tones. "I don't care what it costs," he was saying. "Find her, find my little girl." Maria knocked softly on the doorframe, turned, his expression immediately shifting to one of irritation at the interruption. "What is it?" he snapped. "I specifically said no interruptions." "Mr. Maria said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "My name is Maria Santos. I'm one of the cleaning staff. I need to tell you something about your daughter." The phone slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. His face went completely white, and for a moment Maria thought he might collapse. "What did you say?" he whispered. "I found Emma this morning, sir. She's safe. She's here in the building." The transformation in Richard's face was instantaneous. The exhausted, desperate father disappeared, replaced by a man of action, a man accustomed to taking control of impossible situations. "Where is she?" he demanded, already moving toward the door. "She's safe," Maria repeated. "But mister, there are things you need to know, things about how I found her and what she told me. I think someone close to your family is involved." Stopped in his tracks, his eyes boring into Maria's with an intensity that was almost frightening. "Tell me everything, now." Maria took a deep breath and began to speak, knowing that once she started, there would be no going back. "I found her in the alley behind this building at 6:45 this morning. She was half frozen, wearing only a nightgown. Someone had left her there to die." As Maria told her story, she watched Richard's face cycle through a range of emotions: relief, rage, gratitude, and something else that looked almost like fear. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, processing the implications of what she had told him. "This person who took her," he said finally. "Emma said he mentioned that her parents didn't want her anymore." "Yes, sir, and she said he told someone on the phone that the job was done." His hands clenched into fists. "Someone wanted me to believe my daughter was dead. Someone wanted me to suffer." His voice was deadly quiet. "Take me to her now." Maria led him through the hallways to the supply closet, her heart pounding with each step. When she unlocked the door, Emma looked up from where she was sitting among the cleaning supplies. still wrapped in Maria's jacket. For a moment, father and daughter simply stared at each other as if neither could believe what they were seeing. Then Emma whispered, "Daddy," and Richard fell to his knees, gathering his daughter into his arms with a broken sob that echoed through the small room. Maria stepped back, giving them privacy for their reunion, but also watching carefully for any signs that Emma was afraid of her father. The little girl's reaction told her everything she needed to know. This was not a man who had arranged for his own daughter's kidnapping. This was a father who had been through hell for the past 2 days, believing his child might be dead. After several minutes of tears and whispered reassurances, looked up at Maria with eyes that held more gratitude than she had ever seen in another human being. "You saved her life," he said simply. "You saved my daughter's life." But even as he spoke those words, Maria could see the calculating mind of a businessman at work behind his eyes. He was already thinking ahead, already considering the implications and the dangers that might still be lurking. "Maria," he said, his voice taking on a tone of quiet urgency, "what you've done today, it puts you in danger. Whoever did this, they can't know that Emma has been found. Not yet. Not until I know who I can trust." The weight of his words settled over Maria like a heavy blanket. By saving Emma, she had stepped into a world of wealth and power and danger that she had never imagined. There was no going back to her simple life of cleaning offices and going home to her empty apartment. She was part of this now, whether she wanted to be or not. "What do you want me to do, mister?" she asked. Richard looked down at his daughter, who had fallen asleep in his arms, exhausted by her ordeal. When he looked back at Maria, there was a fierce determination in his eyes that spoke of a man who would do whatever it took to protect his family. "I want you to disappear," he said. "Both of you, until I can figure out who betrayed us and make sure they can never hurt Emma again. Will you help me?" Maria thought of her small apartment, her routine, her predictable life. Then she looked at the sleeping child in her father's arms and thought of those blue eyes full of trust and hope. "Yes," she said without hesitation, "I'll help you." Outside the supply closet, the business of the industries building continued as normal. Phones rang, meetings were held, deals were made. But in that small room filled with cleaning supplies, 3 lives had been forever changed. A father had found his daughter, a daughter had found safety, and a humble cleaning woman had found a purpose greater than she had ever imagined. The safe house was nothing like Maria had expected. When Richard said they needed to disappear, she had imagined some kind of hotel or maybe a friend's house. Instead, she found herself in a sprawling estate 2 hours outside Chicago, surrounded by woods and protected by security measures that seemed more appropriate for a military installation than a family retreat. "This belonged to my grandfather," explained as their car passed through the 3rd checkpoint. "He built it during Prohibition when he needed a place to conduct business away from prying eyes. I've modernized the security, but the isolation remains the same." Emma had slept for most of the journey, curled up in the backseat between Maria and a woman named Sarah, whom had introduced as his head of security. Sarah was small and quiet, but Maria could see the careful way her eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, and she had noticed the gun holstered beneath the woman's jacket. The house itself was impressive, a massive log structure that managed to look both rustic and elegant. Inside, it was equipped with every modern convenience, including a communications center that looked like something from a spy movie. Wasted no time in getting to work. "I need to know who I can trust," he said, settling Emma on a comfortable couch in the main living room while Sarah began checking the security systems. "My wife is in Europe on business. She's been there for a week, which gives her an alibi but also means she's out of immediate danger. My household staff, my business partners, my security team, any one of them could have provided the information needed to take Emma." Maria listened as began making calls, his voice taking on the commanding tone of a man accustomed to getting answers. But even as she admired his efficiency, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something important. "Mister," she said during a break in his phone calls. "Emma said something else when I found her. She said the man told her that her mommy and daddy didn't want her anymore. But why would he say that? If this was about money or business, why would he care about making her feel abandoned?" Paused, his hand halfway to his phone. "What are you thinking, Maria?" "I'm thinking this wasn't just about taking Emma. Someone wanted to hurt you personally to make you suffer. And they wanted Emma to suffer too. That sounds like revenge to me." Sarah looked up from her laptop, where she had been monitoring various security feeds. Maria's right. Professional kidnappings are about leverage or money. This feels personal. Over the next several hours, a clearer picture began to emerge. Using his extensive network of contacts and resources, started to piece together the events of the past week. Emma had been taken on Sunday night, sometime between 10 p.m. when had called from London to say goodnight, and 6 a.m. when the nanny had discovered her missing from her bedroom. The kidnapper had disabled the security system with codes that could only have come from someone with high-level access. He had known exactly which room was Emma's, had known the family's routines, and had somehow managed to take a 5-year-old child without her making enough noise to wake anyone else in the house. The inside man has to be someone close to the family, Sarah concluded as they reviewed the evidence. Someone Emma would trust enough to go with quietly, at least initially. But even as they narrowed down the list of suspects, Maria found herself thinking about something else Emma had said. The little girl was remarkably resilient, bouncing back from her ordeal with the adaptability of childhood, but occasionally she would make comments that suggested she knew more about her situation than she was letting on. "Emma, sweetheart," Maria said that evening as she helped the child get ready for bed in one of the guest rooms. "When the bad man took you from your house, did he say anything about why he was doing it?" Emma thought for a moment, her small face serious. "He said someone wanted to teach Daddy a lesson. He said Daddy took something that didn't belong to him." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. "Did he say what your daddy took?" "Something about a building, a special building that belonged to someone else's family." When Maria reported this conversation too, his face went completely white. "Dear God," he whispered, "the Henderson property." "What's the Henderson property?" Sarah asked. Began packing the room, his mind clearly racing. 3 months ago, I acquired a piece of property in downtown Chicago. The seller was Victoria Henderson, an elderly woman who needed to liquidate her assets to pay for her husband's medical care. It was a fair deal, market value, completely legal. "But," Maria prompted. But the property had been in the Henderson family for 4 generations. Victoria's nephew had been living there his entire life. He expected to inherit it, but his aunt never updated her will. When she sold it to me, lost everything, his home, his inheritance, his future. Sarah was already pulling up files on her laptop. Henderson, age 38, unemployed, recently divorced. His ex-wife filed multiple restraining orders against him for threatening behavior. "I remember him," said grimly. "He came to my office twice, demanding that I sell the property back to him for what his aunt paid originally. When I refused, he became abusive. Security had to escort him out." "And you think he took Emma to get revenge?" Maria asked. "I think Henderson decided to take away what was most precious to me, the same way I supposedly took away what was most precious to him." His voice was thick with guilt and anger. "I need to call the FBI." But Sarah held up a hand. "Wait, if Henderson is our guy, calling in federal agents might spook him into doing something desperate. We need to be smarter about this." "What are you suggesting?" demanded. "I'm suggesting we use the fact that he doesn't know we've found Emma. Let him think his plan worked. Draw him out into the open where we can get to him safely." The plan they devised was risky, but it had the advantage of putting them in control of the situation rather than simply reacting to Henderson's moves. Using his media contacts, arranged for a carefully worded news story to appear in the Chicago Tribune the next morning. The story reported that Emma remained missing after 3 days, and that her father was offering a substantial reward for information leading to her safe return. The article also mentioned that Richard had been devastated by his daughter's disappearance and was reconsidering several recent business deals, including the Henderson property, in order to focus on his family crisis. "If Henderson is monitoring the news, and he almost certainly is, this should bring him out," Sarah explained. "He'll want to gloat to see the results of his revenge up close." They didn't have to wait long. By noon, Henderson had called his office 3 times, each time hanging up when he reached the answering service. Sarah's monitoring equipment picked up his location during the 3rd call. He was using a less than 6 blocks from the industry's building. "He's watching the building," Sarah concluded, "probably hopping to see Richard in person to witness his suffering firsthand." "Then let's give him what he wants to see," said grimly. The trap was set for late that afternoon. Would return to his office, making sure to look appropriately devastated for Henderson's benefit. Sarah and her team would be positioned throughout the area, ready to move in when Henderson showed himself. And Maria would stay at the safe house with Emma, monitoring everything through secure communications. It was nearly 5 o'clock when Henderson finally made his move. Sarah's voice came through the communications system with barely controlled excitement. Target acquired. He's approaching the building from the south entrance, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. Sir, you were right. He wants to see you up close. Through the security cameras they had positioned around the building, Maria watched as Henderson, a tall, thin man with unkempt hair and desperate eyes, approached the main entrance of Industries. He looked exactly like someone who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. But as Maria watched Henderson's approach, something nagged at her. Something about his body language, the way he moved, didn't match Emma's description of her kidnapper. The little girl had said the bad man was tall, and Henderson was certainly that. But Emma had also said he was confident, threatening, someone who scared her. The man on the security feed looked broken, defeated, more like someone asking for help than someone who had orchestrated an elaborate revenge plot. Wait, Maria said into her communication device. Something's not right. But her warning came too late. Henderson had already entered the building, already been spotted by building security, already been identified as a potential threat. And in the chaos that followed, as security guards surrounded him and police sirens wailed in the distance, the real kidnapper was probably watching from somewhere safe, laughing at how perfectly his plan was working. It wasn't until Henderson was in custody, protesting his innocence and demanding to know what he was being accused of, that the terrible truth became clear. Henderson was guilty of many things: harassment, trespassing, making threats against Richard, but he wasn't guilty of kidnapping Emma. His alibi is solid, Sarah reported grimly. He was in a holding cell Sunday night for drunk and disorderly conduct, didn't get released until Monday afternoon, hours after Emma was already missing. Then who took her? Demanded. Maria felt a sick certainty settling in her stomach. Someone who wanted us to think it was Henderson. Someone who knew about the property dispute, who knew Henderson had threatened you, who knew he would be the perfect person to take the blame. But that means, his voice trailed off as the implications hit him. That means the real kidnapper is still out there, Sarah finished, and he's been playing us from the beginning. The realization that they had been manipulated sent the entire team back to square one, but with a new sense of urgency. If the kidnapper was sophisticated enough to frame someone else for his crime, he was also smart enough to have backup plans, other ways to strike at the family. We need to think about this differently, Maria said as they gathered in the safe house's communications center. Whoever did this knows your family intimately. He knew your security codes, he knew Emma's routine, he even knew about the Henderson situation. This isn't some outside threat, this is someone you trust. Emma, who had been quietly coloring at a nearby table, looked up at the sound of her name. The bad man smelled like Uncle James's cologne, she said matter-of-factly. The kind that burns your nose. The adults in the room went completely silent. His face went ashen. What did you say, sweetheart? His cologne, it was the same kind Uncle James wears. Mommy always tells him to use less because it's too strong. James whispered, my business partner, my oldest friend. Sarah was already pulling up files on her laptop but was shaking his head in disbelief. It can't be James. We've been friends for 25 years. He's Emma's godfather, for God's sake. He loves her like his own daughter. Tell me about your relationship with him, Maria said gently. Any recent problems, disagreements, anything that might have changed between you. Thought for a long moment. The Henderson property, he said finally. James advised against buying it. He said it would cause too much trouble, that we should find something else. When I went ahead with the purchase anyway, he was upset. How upset? Sarah asked. Very upset. He said I was becoming ruthless, that I was losing sight of what was important. We had a terrible argument about it, he said. He said I was turning into the kind of man who destroys families for profit. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. James hadn't just disagreed with his business decision. He had taken it as a fundamental betrayal of their friendship and shared values. In his mind, Richard had become someone who needed to be taught a lesson, someone who needed to understand what it felt like to have his own family destroyed. He wasn't trying to kill Emma, Maria realized. He was trying to teach you a lesson about the Henderson family, make you understand what you had done to them by taking away what was most precious to you. But he would have let her die, said, his voice filled with anguish. If you hadn't found her, if you hadn't been there. I don't think he intended for it to go that far, Sarah said, studying psychological profile. Classic narcissistic personality, he would have convinced himself that Emma would be found before any real harm came to her. In his mind, he was just giving you a scare, making you appreciate your family more. But Maria wasn't convinced it was that simple. There's something else, she said. Emma, when the bad man left you in the alley, did he say anything else? Anything about when someone would find you? Emma's face clouded with memory. He said someone would come for me in the morning. He said Daddy would learn to be grateful. The adults exchanged glances. Had known that the building's cleaning staff arrived early, had known that someone would find Emma before she was seriously hurt. But he had also known that those early morning hours in the October cold could have killed her. We need to move carefully, Sarah warned. Is desperate now that his plan has fallen apart. If he realizes that Emma is safe and that we're onto him, he might do something even more dangerous. But was already reaching for his phone. I'm calling him. I want to hear his voice when he thinks he's won. The call went through immediately, as if had been waiting for it. His voice was carefully modulated, full of fake concern and sympathy. Richard, I just heard about Emma. My God, I can't imagine what you're going through. Is there anything I can do to help? Maria watched his face as he listened to his oldest friend lie to him with apparent sincerity. She could see the exact moment when the last of his hope died, when he fully accepted that the person he had trusted most in the world had betrayed him in the most devastating way possible. Actually, James, there is something you can do, said, his voice steady despite the pain in his eyes. I need to see you tonight. Can you come to the office? Of course, I'll be there in an hour. As ended the call, Emma looked up from her coloring book with those impossibly blue eyes that seemed to see everything. Is Uncle James going to jail? She asked. Knelt down beside his daughter's chair, taking her small hands in his. Yes, sweetheart, Uncle James did something very bad and he has to face the consequences. Will he say he's sorry? Emma asked with the innocent hope of childhood. His voice broke slightly as he answered. I don't know, baby. Sometimes grown-ups do terrible things and they never say they're sorry. But Maria was thinking about something else, something that had been bothering her since the beginning. Mister, how exactly did you and James become business partners? What brought you together originally? We met in college, said. James was the one who convinced me to go into real estate. He said we could make a difference, help families find homes, build communities. It was his dream as much as mine. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. James hadn't just been angry about one property deal. He had been angry about what Richard had become, how far they had both drifted from their original ideals. In his twisted mind, kidnapping Emma wasn't just revenge. It was an attempt to shock his old friend back into being the person he used to be. He's going to confess, Maria realized. When you confront him tonight, he's going to confess everything. In his mind, this was all for your own good. He'll expect you to understand, maybe even thank him. Sarah shook her head. The arrogance of that kind of thinking is staggering. But was looking at Maria with something like awe. How did you know? How did you figure all this out? Maria thought about her answer for a moment. I spend my life cleaning up other people's messes, she said finally. You learn to see the patterns, to understand why people do the things they do. Your friend James made a mess, and now we have to clean it up. As evening fell over the safe house, the three adults prepared for the confrontation that would finally end Emma's ordeal. But Maria knew that the real work was just beginning. A little girl would need time to heal from the trauma of betrayal by someone she loved. A father would need to rebuild his ability to trust. And somewhere in Chicago, a broken man would have to face the consequences of what he had done in the name of friendship. The confrontation took place in the Industries building at 8 o'clock that evening. James arrived precisely on time, carrying flowers and wearing an expression of carefully crafted concern. Maria watched through the security cameras as he entered the building, noting how he moved with the confidence of someone who belonged there, someone who had every right to be there. Richard waited in his office, connected to Maria and Sarah through a secure communication link. The plan was simple. Let reveal himself, get a confession on record, and then turn everything over to the FBI. But as Maria watched approach through the building, she felt an uneasy certainty that nothing about this confrontation would be simple. "He's on his way up," Sarah reported from her position in the lobby. "And Richard, he looks genuinely concerned. If I didn't know better, I'd believe he was here to comfort a grieving friend." Knocked gently on his office door before entering. Through the hidden cameras, Maria could see him embrace his oldest friend, offering words of comfort and support that sounded completely sincere. "Any word from the kidnappers?" asked as he settled into a chair across from his desk. "Any ransom demands?" "Nothing," replied, his voice heavy with false despair. "It's been 3 days, James. 3 days with no word, no contact, nothing. What kind of person takes a 5-year-old child and just disappears?" Maria watched his face carefully as spoke. For just a moment, she saw something flicker across his features, satisfaction, perhaps, or vindication. It was quickly replaced by an expression of sympathy, but that brief glimpse confirmed everything they had suspected. "I can't imagine what you're going through," said, leaning forward with apparent concern. "But you have to hold on to hope. Emma is a strong little girl, whoever has her. Maybe they just want to scare you. Maybe this is about money or business, something that can be resolved." "You think this is about business?" asked, and Maria could hear the careful control in his voice. "Well, you have to consider the possibility. You've made a lot of enemies over the years, Richard. The Henderson deal, for instance, that was unnecessarily cruel. That family had owned that property for generations. There it was, couldn't resist the opportunity to lecture, to drive home the lesson he thought he was teaching." Maria felt her hands clench into fists as she watched this man who had terrorized a 5-year-old child sit in judgment of her father. "You think I deserved this?" asked quietly. "You think Emma deserved this because of a property deal?" His mask began to slip. "I think sometimes people need to be reminded of what's really important. You've become so focused on profit, on winning at any cost, that you've forgotten about the human cost of your actions. And you decided to teach me that lesson by taking my daughter." The question hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Went very still, his eyes fixed on his face, perhaps realizing for the first time that this wasn't the conversation he had expected to have. "What are you suggesting, Richard?" "I'm suggesting that you know exactly where Emma is because you're the one who took her." For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then his face underwent a complete transformation. The mask of concern and sympathy fell away, replaced by something cold and calculating. But underneath that, Maria could see something else, the desperate, wounded look of a man who had expected gratitude and found accusation instead. "You were supposed to learn," said, his voice no longer carrying any pretense of sympathy. "You were supposed to understand what you had done to the Henderson family, what you've been doing to people for years. Taking and taking and taking without any thought for the consequences. So you took my daughter, my 5-year-old daughter. I gave you a gift," exploded, rising from his chair. "I gave you perspective. Do you have any idea what it feels like to lose everything that matters to you? To watch someone you trusted destroy your life without a second thought?" Stood as well, his own anger finally breaking through his careful control. "Emma could have died, James, if Maria Santos hadn't found her, if she had been out there just a few hours longer." "Someone would have found her," said dismissively. "I made sure of that. I'm not a monster, Richard. I just wanted you to remember what it feels like to be human." The casual way he dismissed Emma's suffering, his complete inability to see the horror of what he had done, sent a chill through Maria that had nothing to do with the October weather. This wasn't a man who had been driven to desperate measures by grief or anger. This was a man who had convinced himself that his actions were not only justified but noble. "Where is she, James?" demanded. "Where is my daughter?" Smiled, and the expression was one of the most unsettling things Maria had ever seen. "Safe," he said. "Safer than she's ever been. Away from a father who values profit over people, who would rather destroy families than lose a deal." "You son of a bitch," whispered. "You actually believe you're the good guy in this story." "I am the good guy," replied with absolute conviction. 25 years ago, we started this company to help people, to build something meaningful. Look at what you've become, Richard. Look at what we've become. The Henderson property was the last straw, but it's been building for years. You've lost your soul. And you thought kidnapping my daughter would help me find it again. I thought giving you a taste of real loss might remind you what matters. The Henderson family lost their home, their history, their future because of you. Now you know what that feels like." Maria listened to this exchange with growing horror. Wasn't just unrepentant, he was genuinely convinced that he had been doing a favor. In his twisted logic, traumatizing Emma and terrorizing her parents was an act of friendship, a necessary intervention to save Richard's soul. But what truly terrified Maria was the realization that still didn't understand that his plan had failed. He was speaking about Emma in the present tense, as if she were still hidden somewhere, still in his control. Which meant, "James," said, his voice taking on a different quality, "where exactly do you think Emma is right now?" Smile widened. "Somewhere you'll never find her until you agree to make things right, give the Henderson property back to, publicly apologize for what you've done. Show some humility for once in your life. Then maybe we can discuss returning your daughter." The silence that followed this demand was deafening. Stared at his oldest friend with an expression of complete disbelief, while Maria felt her blood run cold as the full scope of delusion became clear. He didn't know that Emma had been found. He didn't know that his carefully crafted plan had collapsed within hours of its execution. He was still operating under the assumption that he held all the cards that was at his mercy. "You're insane," said finally. "You're actually insane." "I'm the only sane person in this room," replied. "I'm the only one who remembers what we used to stand for." It was then that made a decision that changed everything. Instead of continuing to play along with his delusions, instead of trying to extract more information about his plans, he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small device that Maria recognized as a baby monitor receiver. Emma's voice filled the room, clear and unmistakable, as she called out from the safe house. "Daddy, when are you coming home? Maria is making hot chocolate." His face went completely white. He stumbled backward, knocking over his chair, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "That's impossible," he whispered. I left her. How did you?" "I found her," said, his voice deadly quiet. "Or rather, Maria Santos found her, half frozen in an alley where you left her to die. Your brilliant plan failed, James. It failed because you underestimated the kindness of a stranger." The transformation was immediate and terrifying. The self-righteous conviction disappeared, replaced by pure panic. He began packing the room like a caged animal, his hands shaking, his breathing rapid and shallow. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising to nearly a shout. "You weren't supposed to find her yet. You were supposed to suffer. You were supposed to learn." "I did learn," replied. "I learned that my oldest friend is a psychopath who would traumatize a child to prove a point." Spun around to face him, and Maria saw madness in his eyes. "This isn't over," he snarled. "You think finding her once means she's safe? You think I don't have other plans?" The threat was clear, and his hand moved toward the panic button on his desk, but was already moving, already heading for the door, his face twisted with rage and desperation. "Sarah, he's running," spoke into his communication device. "Stop him." But knew the building as well as did. He knew about the service elevators, the back staircases, the loading dock exits. By the time Sarah and her team converged on his office, was already gone, disappeared into the Chicago night with the knowledge that his plan had failed and his freedom was forfeit. "He's not thinking rationally anymore," Sarah warned as they reviewed the security footage. "He's gone from calculated revenge to desperate improvisation. That makes him infinitely more dangerous." Back at the safe house, Maria held Emma close as explained what had happened. The little girl listened with the serious expression of a child trying to understand something far beyond her years. "Uncle James is really angry with Daddy," Emma observed when finished his explanation. "Yes, sweetheart. Uncle James is very sick in his mind, and when people are that sick, sometimes they do terrible things." "Will he try to hurt me again?" The question broke Maria's heart, but she was proud of how directly Emma faced her fear. "We won't let that happen," Maria promised. "Your daddy and I and all the other people who care about you, we're going to make sure you're safe." But even as she spoke those words, Maria knew that their ordeal was far from over. Was still out there, still convinced that he was fighting for some noble cause, still dangerous to everyone connected to the family. Over the next several days, a massive manhunt unfolded across Chicago and the surrounding areas. The FBI, the Chicago Police Department, and Richard's private security team all worked together to track down James. But the man had vanished as completely as if he had never existed. What they did find was evidence of just how deep his obsession had run. His apartment revealed months of planning. Walls covered with photographs of the family, detailed schedules of their daily routines, and newspaper clippings about every business deal Richard had made in the past 5 years. This wasn't just about the Henderson property, Agent Sarah explained during one of their daily briefings. This was about years of accumulated resentment and jealousy. In's mind had betrayed everything they had once shared, and Emma's kidnapping was just the beginning of a larger plan to destroy his life completely. They also found evidence that had been embezzling money from their joint business ventures for over a year, siphoning funds into offshore accounts that would allow him to disappear permanently if his plan succeeded. He wasn't just planning to teach you a lesson, the FBI agent explained too. He was planning to destroy you financially and personally, then disappear with enough money to start over somewhere else. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a detailed plan for Emma's education during her captivity. Had genuinely believed that he could convince a 5-year-old child that her parents didn't love her, that they had abandoned her by choice. He had planned to keep her for weeks or even months, slowly breaking down her attachment to her family and rebuilding her loyalty to him. He saw himself as her savior, the psychologist brought in to analyze the evidence explained. In his mind, he was rescuing Emma from parents who had lost their moral compass. The fact that this required traumatizing her was just an unfortunate necessity. As the search for continued, life at the safe house settled into a strange routine. Emma, with the remarkable resilience of childhood, began to recover from her trauma. She had nightmares sometimes, and she was more clingy than usual, but she was eating well and playing and slowly returning to being a normal 5-year-old. Maria found herself in an impossible position. She had saved Emma's life, and for that, Richard was eternally grateful. He had offered her money, a new job, anything she wanted. But what Maria wanted was something that couldn't be bought or given. She wanted to know that Emma would be safe, that she would never again be hurt by someone she trusted. "I can't go back to my old life," Maria told during one of their evening conversations. "I can't go back to pretending that none of this happened, that Emma isn't still in danger." "Then don't go back," replied. "Stay with us, help me protect her, help me raise her to be strong enough to handle whatever the world throws at her." It was an offer that would have seemed impossible just a week earlier. A billionaire businessman asking a cleaning lady to become part of his family. But Emma had already made the choice for all of them. She had attached herself to Maria with the fierce loyalty of a child who knew she had been saved, and no amount of money or social convention could change that bond. "Maria is my other mommy now," Emma announced one evening as they sat together reading stories. "She found me when I was lost, so now she's mine to keep." The simplicity of childhood logic cut through all the complexities of class and race and social expectations. Emma didn't care that Maria cleaned office buildings for a living, or that she lived in a small apartment on the South Side, or that society would consider their connection unusual. All Emma knew was that Maria had been there when she needed someone most, and that was enough. The end came suddenly, 3 weeks after his disappearance. He was found in a small town in Wisconsin, living under a false name and working as a night janitor at a local school. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who had looked down on Maria for her humble profession had ended up doing the same kind of work himself. He was arrested without incident, sitting quietly in the school's break room during his dinner hour, eating a sandwich and reading a newspaper. According to the arresting officers, he seemed almost relieved to be caught, as if the strain of running had finally become too much to bear. At his trial, lawyers tried to argue temporary insanity, claiming that years of stress and business pressure had caused a complete mental breakdown. But the evidence of premeditation was too overwhelming, the planning too detailed, the execution too calculated. James was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for kidnapping, child endangerment, and a host of other charges. Maria was there for the sentencing, sitting in the gallery with Richard and watching as his former friend was led away in handcuffs. Turned to look at them just once before disappearing through the courtroom door, and Maria saw in his eyes the same thing she had seen that first day in the alley, a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. But this time, she felt no sympathy for him. In the months that followed, life slowly returned to something approaching normal for the family. Emma started school, making friends and learning to trust again. Returned from Europe, embracing Maria as the woman who had saved her daughter's life and welcoming her into their family without reservation. and Maria found herself living a life she never could have imagined. She moved into a guest house on the estate, officially employed as Emma's nanny, but functioning more as a beloved family member. She learned to drive expensive cars and attend private school events and navigate the complex social world of Chicago's elite. But most importantly, she learned that sometimes the most extraordinary changes in life begin with the simplest acts of human kindness. She had seen a child in need and had responded with compassion, without thought for the consequences or complications that might follow. That single moment of moral clarity had changed not just Emma's life, but her own. Emma, now 7 years old and thriving, still sometimes asks about Uncle James and why he did such terrible things. Maria always tells her the same thing, that sometimes people make very bad choices when they're hurt and angry, but that doesn't excuse them from facing the consequences of those choices. The important thing, Maria always adds, is that you're safe now and you're loved, and there are people in this world who will always protect you. And Emma, with the wisdom that sometimes comes to children who have faced darkness and found their way back to light, always nods solemnly and says, "I know. I have you and Daddy and Mommy. I have my family." The story that began with a black maid finding a white billionaire's daughter in a dumpster had evolved into something much more profound. A testament to the power of human courage, the strength of unlikely bonds, and the truth that family isn't always defined by blood or circumstance, but by love and loyalty and the willingness to sacrifice for one another. Maria Santos never returned to cleaning office buildings, but in many ways, she never stopped being what she had always been, someone who saw messes that needed to be cleaned up and simply did what needed to be done. The only difference was that now, instead of cleaning floors and windows, she was helping to heal hearts and build futures and prove that sometimes the most important rescues happen when we least expect them, carried out by people we might otherwise never notice. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, those rescues save more than one life at a time. The story that had begun with a cleaning lady finding a child in a dumpster was about to end with the exposure of a betrayal that went to the very heart of family, friendship, and the price of success in a ruthless world. The real story, Maria realized, was just beginning.